All right, let's go ahead and get started with the introductions and the first few minutes of our presentation. I'm sure more people will be joining. Welcome everyone to our second monthly webinar series, in a webinar series. First things first is you will note that we are recording this and we'll be putting this up on our website for future use, and one of the resources we'd like to provide with Road to Recovery. And also just a reminder, until we get to the question and answer period, really helpful for you to keep your microphone on mute. We will have plenty of time for questions and answers, and this will be a really interesting presentation. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. We're doing these webinars to spotlight I'm Paul Schmidt. I'm the executive director of Road to Recovery. And we're doing these webinars to spotlight the great work that's going on to recover species. We normally do these webinars. We've only had one so far, but we're trying to do them on the second Friday of each month. But due to the holiday last week, we moved this one to this Friday. But future ones will most of the time occur on the second Friday of the month. We are excited to spotlight one of our pilot species this month. Last month's presentation on the least tern is available on our website at r2rbirds.org if you want to see that, if you missed it. And then finally, as some beginning, just a reminder that we are planning our first in-person workshop for Road to Recovery, January 17th through the 19th at the National Conservation and Training Center in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. It's run by the Fish and Wildlife Service. We encourage you to register and attend that workshop. We have a great agenda that's been planned, and I'm sure you will benefit. If you are working in bird recovery, science, conservation, you will benefit from a couple of days at that workshop. You can see more details on our website, again, r2rbirds.org. And with that, I'm going to kick it over to Quinn Carvey, who is our graduate fellow who helps with these webinars and other parts of Road to Recovery. Quinn?
Hi, Paul. Thanks for the introduction. As Paul mentioned, I'm Quinn Carvey. I'm the graduate fellow with Road to Recovery, and I'm excited to be introducing today's presenters. They are both part of the International Lesser Yellowlegs Working Group, which, as Paul mentioned, is one of Road to Recovery's pilot species working groups. They're going to be giving a talk titled Lesser Yellowlegs Research and Conservation, Filling Knowledge Gaps While Moving to Action. Our first presenter is Dr. Christie. Katie is a wildlife biologist for Alaska Department of Fish and Game, where she focuses on avian and small mammal research. Katie earned her master's degree from the University of Victoria on the connection between salmon and birds in coastal temperate rainforests, and her PhD from the University of Fairbanks on ptarmigan ecology in the Arctic. Katie enjoys building collaborative relationships with other agencies, academic institutions, and nonprofits to solve critical problems related to wildlife conservation. She spent the last 6 years investigating lesser yellowlegs breeding ecology and survival, and is a member of the Lesser Yellowlegs Working Group and Road to Recovery leadership team. Our second presenter today is Kelly Srigley Werner. Kelly retired from a 34-year career with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in 2021, where for 28 years, she served as Missouri State Private Lands Coordinator and Administrator for the Partners for Fish and Wildlife Program. With a passion for wetland conservation and restoration, Kelly has worked with landowners, NGOs, state agencies, and other federal agencies in partnership to advance conservation for fish and wildlife. During her career, she has also worked in water quality, aquatic contaminants, endangered species conservation, and policy issues. In retirement, Kelly serves on the Lesser Yellowlegs International Working Group as the working group coordinator. So in conclusion, thank you both Katie and Kelly for your presentation today, and I'll turn it over to you for your presentation.
Thank you, Quinn. I'm Katie Christie, and today I'm going to talk to you about lesser yellowlegs research and conservation. And we've divided this talk into two parts. So I'm going to talk about the research and what we have learned so far, and then Kelly's going to do the second part of the talk. Okay, so here's an outline. I'm going to start by briefly discussing the Road to Recovery approach and how that fits into lesser yellowlegs research and conservation. I'm going to give some background on lesser yellowlegs and what we've learned so far. And I'm going to provide some information on some of the recent scientific insights that we've had. Then Kelly's going to take over and talk about some of the exciting stuff we've been working on over the past few years, our conservation strategies and the human aspects, the human dimension aspects of the project. So the Road to Recovery approach stemmed from Rosenberg's paper and in 2019, which we all know about and made a really big impact because it documented the decline of almost 3 billion birds since the 1970s. So this spurred the Road to Recovery initiative. And this initiative its goal is to reverse declines of bird species in North America. And to do this, it provides support for species working groups. It supports high urgency, so identifies high urgency tipping point species and provides support for the working groups. And it encourages them to understand population linkages and limiting factors while also framing conservation strategies within the needs of people and communities. So the lesser yellowlegs has been identified as a high urgency tipping point species due to its vulnerability to extinction and recent steep population declines. So multiple lines of evidence point to these declines, including surveys across the breeding range, 2 different types of surveys in Alaska, as well as surveys of these birds at migratory stopovers. And this graph shows a recent paper by Smith and others showing that lesser yellowlegs are one of the top 4 species that are declining the most rapidly. And you can see here that lesser yellowlegs are declining at a rate of about 60% over the past 3 generations. So this is not only are they declining over the past few decades, their declines appear to be particularly steep in recent years. So this is the way that we are thinking about lesser yellowlegs conservation, and we're using the Road to Recovery approach to refine our methods. So we are conducting biological research and filling key information gaps about this species, its migration, connectivity, demography, and identifying threats, while simultaneously creating partnerships with people on the ground that are going to be part of the solution in terms of conservation. And so we are listening to communities on the ground in areas where we are going to be focusing for conservation. So we're listening to what they have to say, reaching out to them, forging important relationships with them. Kelly's going to talk a lot more about this. And we're also conducting research and learning from that. And so the information that is coming in from the biology as well as the human dimensions aspects of this project contribute to us hopefully enacting really impactful conservation actions. And it's an iterative process, so we're continually updating our knowledge about the species and the human dimensions of conservation issues surrounding this species so that we can improve our conservation actions. And this wouldn't be possible without the support of the Knobloch Family Foundation. So the Knobloch family really helped accelerate this process and provided the support that was necessary to hire our working group coordinator, Kelly, who has made a huge impact, as well as do some of the biological research to fill in some of the important information gaps. So I want to acknowledge the Knobloch family in really accelerating this process. So we got together over a year ago, the Lesser Yellowlegs Working Group, and we had a very large list of possible conservation challenges for these were challenges that were identified in the Mid-Continent Shorebird Plan. And so we had this long list of threats or conservation challenges, and we really wanted to narrow them down to a more manageable list of threats that were really likely to impact this species and that we should focus on for our conservation actions. So we got together as a working group and we identified the threats that we felt had the largest impact on lesser yellowlegs as a species. And these threats are here. They're habitat conversion, agricultural pesticides, water and sediment management, changes in temperature and precipitation linked to climate change, harvest, and agricultural effluence. So we felt this was a much more manageable list of threats that we could really dig into. And you'll notice that many of these threats are linked to agriculture, and you'll see why in a few slides. So I'll talk about the biological research that we have been conducting on this species, and we've learned quite a bit over the past few years. So we completed a migration tracking study where we were interested in understanding linked populations, critical stopover areas, and relative exposure to harvest during migration and the non-breeding season. We conducted a genetics study with Sarah Sonsagan and Rob Wilson to sequence the genome and identify whether distinct population subunits existed and whether we could identify markers that could link breeding populations to non-breeding populations. We are conducting an ongoing demography study, and our hope is to understand what limits reproduction and survival. And then we have a pesticide study underway where we are looking at pesticide exposure in agricultural areas. In particular, we're looking at neonicotinoid pesticides, or neonics, and how they affect stopover ecology and physiology of lesser yellowlegs, and whether they're impacting lesser yellowlegs' ability to successfully refuel at stopover sites. So this is a map that we produced recently, and I'm going to talk about it because it really illustrates a lot of the recent findings that we've had. So Laura McDuffie completed her master's thesis on lesser yellowlegs migration data, and she really helped advance our knowledge of this species and their movements. Laura McDuffie found weak migratory connectivity. So you see in this map, this is a subset of the data. These are only individuals that we were able to track for the entire year. So individuals that we only track for part of the year are not included in this map. You see that we put tags on birds across their breeding range from Alaska all the way to Mingan, Quebec. These were pinpoint GPS transmitters. And they took locations every 2 days during migration, and then at longer intervals during the non-breeding period. And you see that there's a lot of overlap among different breeding populations during migration and the non-breeding period. So all of these colors kind of overlap, especially after during the period when they are funneling through the prairie potholes region. So we found that this region was important for all breeding populations, including and west of Churchill, Manitoba. They really used this area in the prairie potholes region, and then they spread out and migrated to different parts of South America, although we found a concentration of individuals that ended up in the Pampas of Argentina. But we found weak migratory connectivity where the eastern and western populations use different flyways, but there's a lot of overlap during the non-breeding period. The genetics study indicated that this species is panmictic. So despite our best efforts to sequence the genome and look for SNPs, or single nucleotide polymorphisms, that can be used to differentiate different breeding populations, we were unable to find any genetic structure in this species. So the species is panmictic, and that indicates that there's long distance dispersal that's occurring. We also found a parent offspring pair at the far western and easternmost reaches of their breeding range. So this is really interesting. We found a parent in Mingan, Quebec, and its offspring was detected in Canudi National Wildlife Refuge in Alaska. And so this lends support to the idea that significant dispersal is happening. However, we found high breeding site fidelity. So once a bird, an adult bird, selected a breeding site, it had a very high likelihood of returning to within a few hundred meters of where it was banded the previous year. So we have high adult breeding site fidelity, but we have a lot of mixing going on genetically. And so this points towards juvenile dispersal as being the main mechanism by which they're mixing genetically. This is a map put together by Laura and an artist that really does a great job of demonstrating the relative exposure to the risk of harvest in northern South America and the Caribbean islands. So the thickness of the arrows denotes the probability of occurrence in this area during harvest or during the hunting season. And I should point out that tens of thousands of lesser yellowlegs are harvested in this area each year. So we were interested in which breeding populations were exposed to this risk of being in this area during migration. And so we found that birds breeding north of James Bay and Mingan, Quebec, had a much higher likelihood of occurring in this area during the hunting season compared to birds that were breeding in Alaska. So if you're an adult and you breed in Alaska, you don't have a very high likelihood of experiencing this threat. However, if you're breeding in Eastern Canada, you have a much higher likelihood of migrating through this area and being exposed to harvest. However, we know from the genetics data that there's all this dispersal going on. So a chick that's hatched in Alaska is not necessarily going to return to Alaska. It may join another breeding population and subsequently use a migratory pathway that would take it to this area, therefore being exposed to this risk. So the genetics data combined with the tracking data really helped us understand the vulnerability of different age classes to this risk and different breeding segments or breeding populations. This is a map produced by Laura McDuffie that shows different areas that were heavily used by lesser yellowlegs during migration and the non-breeding period. You can see here high densities of yellowlegs in the prairie potholes region. So they use this area extensively during fall and spring migration. They also use the Pampas of Argentina so this was a hot spot during the non-breeding period. And then the Gulf Coast region was important during spring migration, as well as the prairie potholes region. And this is a map that was produced by Shelby McCann. The black dots are the lesser yellowlegs locations from the transmitter data. And this map shows that they are using both wetlands surrounded by grasslands, so these green areas, as well as the beige areas that are herbaceous cropland. So these are really intensely managed agricultural areas. And you can see that agriculture and lesser yellowlegs are not necessarily mutually exclusive. They are using these agricultural areas. And our next question is to understand the quality of these habitats and whether lesser yellowlegs that are stopping over in these agricultural areas are able to meet the demands of their migrations. Are they able to refuel adequately? Are there sufficient numbers of invertebrates for them to forage on? And are they being exposed to pesticides in these areas? I also want to point out that the Pampas region of Argentina has a really high cropland density relative to other parts of South America. So this is one of the most intensively managed agricultural areas in South America. And lesser yellowlegs use these croplands. And so this is the reason why we are focusing a lot on agriculture for our conservation efforts. They are highly dependent and influenced by agriculture for all of their life cycle, except for when they're breeding in the boreal forests of North America. So I'm going to talk a bit about our current research projects that are underway, where we're trying to answer some key questions. We have a demography study in Anchorage, Alaska, where we have 29 years of data on survival, which is fantastic, with a 10-year gap. But we've been marking and resighting birds for a long time here in Anchorage, and we have also located nests and monitored nests here. So we have a data set on survival and reproductive success. And we're expanding our efforts to research the demography of the species in Churchill, Manitoba, as well as Fairbanks, Alaska, so that we can increase our inference strength beyond just Anchorage. So these are survival rates, apparent survival of adult lesser yellowlegs in Anchorage. And like I said, we have a 29-year data set. Lee Tibbetts back in the 1990s started to tag lesser yellowlegs and give them unique identifiers so that she could recite them, these individuals, in subsequent years. And then the project was on hold in the 2000s. And then she and partners started up the project again in 2010, and we've been banding lesser yellowlegs ever since. So if you look at the purple bars, you will see that there has not been a significant change in survival rates over these three periods. There was a slight increase in the mid 2010s, and then a slight decrease recently, but there's not a significant difference in survival rates over these time periods. But I should point out that survival rates at about 77% are fairly low for a long-lived shorebird. I also want to point out that our transmitters had an effect on survival. So there's a slight decrease in survival with geolocators, which were mounted on the legs. As if you look at this picture here, this bird is carrying a geolocator. And in recent years, we of course used the GPS tags, which provided a huge wealth of information about this species, but they had a significant negative effect on survival. And so that shows that this species is sensitive to these tracking devices. And we should be careful moving forward about using the larger, especially the larger tracking devices. Our next steps are to construct an integrated population model so that we can understand the relative effects of adult survival, recruitment, and reproductive success on population growth rates on this species. So that's our next project. And then I want to talk about briefly Court Brown's work in Churchill. This is Court pointing to a very cryptic lesser yellowlegs nest in Churchill, and he has successfully found quite a few nests, and it's extremely hard to find these nests. So we're thrilled that he has been able to amass this data set, and he will be comparing reproductive success in Anchorage and Churchill. So stay tuned for that new and exciting information. And then this is Shelby McCann, and she is conducting her master's on pesticides in North Dakota. She's at the University of Idaho, and she is sampling lesser yellowlegs as well as other shorebirds. So if you are studying a shorebird that migrates through this area, you should contact Shelby because it's relevant to multiple species of shorebirds. She's sampling them for neonicotinoids in their blood, as well as the water samples that she's taking from different wetlands across North Dakota, and invertebrate samples. So she's looking at whether neonicotinoids can be detected in their blood, what are the pathways through which they're exposed to neonics, and what are the physiological effects on their refueling rates and their behavior. So stay tuned for those results. They should be coming out pretty soon. And with that, I would like to introduce my co-presenter, Kelly, who came on board a couple of years ago now, and she is the best thing that ever happened to the Lesser Yellowlegs Working Group. I highly recommend other working groups to hire a coordinator, at least part-time, She has really advanced our ability to partner with people and really accelerate our conservation actions.
Well, thank you, Katie. I appreciate that. As Katie said, I'm the coordinator for the working group. And one of the things that I spent my entire career on was working in partnership to get things done on the ground. So I'm excited to kind of put the science to use on the ground and to actually work with people to make good things happen for lesser yellowlegs, but not just lesser yellowlegs, also people as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the human dimensions and conservation actions associated with the work that we're doing. Next slide. So moving into action means that, you know, we could study lesser yellowlegs forever. But if we don't start based on what Katie just told us about the population trajectory, if we don't start to work on ways and methods to solve problems, this bird's going to continue to decline. So Katie mentioned that we were looking at the challenges that lesser yellowlegs face, and I don't want you to focus a whole lot on that table other than to know that we actually did prioritize all of the different challenges and came up with 3 major areas that I'll talk about in a few minutes that is really kind of driving our current action right now. The next thing that we're working on now that we've kind of identified what the priority challenges are for this bird is to write an action strategy. And that strategy is going to help guide the process throughout the Western Hemisphere for the conservation of lesser yellowlegs. And along that route, locally, you saw that there's a number of hot spots. And in those hot spots, we want to build trusting relationships. So that's the direction that we're headed. And we're hoping that we can make a difference for this bird as we move forward. Next slide. So conservation action is really about people. And if we put it another way, building partnerships is connecting with people where they live. You need to know your landscape and the biological and societal values that resonate with people who live, work, and play there. You need to understand and express what factors may be impacting people and wildlife. And you need to start the conversation with conservation leaders, with community leaders, and with partner organizations. Engaging those stakeholders is critical to success. And then you need to find some common ground and determine what shared goals you might have and the conservation work needed in a landscape priority area. The next big thing is to find funding. You can't do anything without funding, whether it's research or whether it's building conservation action activities on the ground. I have a colleague that often reminded me that conservation without funding is really just conversation. So you need to have that funding to help generate interest in the work that needs to be done. And then develop a plan, which is what we're in the process of doing now, and begin. And our hope is that we'll be able to celebrate some success of increasing the population of lesser yellowlegs, but also improving habitats for people and wildlife. Next slide. So when you think about a priority landscape, Katie talked about this slide a little bit ago about the southbound and northbound migration, as well as the non-breeding areas. Some of the very important things that you need to understand is knowing your landscape. In other words, walk a mile in someone else's boots, understand what their challenges are, their time commitments, their economies. Again, get those local community leaders and stakeholders and landowners together early to find workable solutions. And you don't do that at the end of your planning, you do that at the beginning of your planning, because everybody then has buy-in and you have been working on building trust on what the end goal is and what you're trying to achieve. You need to solve those problems together and present the ways to do that moving forward. We're hoping that this talk will give you some ideas based on some of the approaches that we're going to be using related to some of the challenge that lesser yellowlegs is facing. And so I'm going to talk about two based on some of those challenges. Next slide. So we want to work towards a sustainable shorebird harvest. For those of you that don't know, there is a hunting culture for lesser yellowlegs in the Caribbean as well as in northern South America. Next slide. And earlier I had mentioned that it's important to know what your cultural and biological needs are in your landscape, or what's going on in your landscape. Know what all those factors are. So for those areas in the Caribbean and in northern South America, there is a long history of organized hunting of shorebirds. And that's been going on since the mid-1600s. So it's a thing, and people really need to be cognizant of that. The critical thing is to think about shorebird harvest as a sustainable harvest. So if this is going to continue, we need to think about it in terms of making it a sustainable approach. We don't really have a full understanding of the current pressure within the flyway, but it is known that there is unsustainable legal and illegal harvest going on, as exemplified by this table. Total annual harvest can be close to 200,000. 71,000 of those birds are lesser yellowlegs. So it's not a sustainable approach. So better options need to be out there. And if we talk about how these different jurisdictions think about hunting, it's pretty unique. So next slide, Katie. So there's lots of different laws, and there's lots of different policies, and there's lots of processes, but they vary widely. And they range from all species protected to no harvest being allowed to completely unregulated harvest. So these different jurisdictions are circled with these different colors. And if you look on the left, the protection levels vary widely, and you can see that Guyana, there's no protection. Suriname, it's fully protected, but fully protected when you move to the right could mean less than 1,000 shorebirds. So something's still going on there. And there's overseas French departments that allow hunting, but they have some legal restrictions. So it's all across the board on what these jurisdictions do. Some really good news, though, is that Barbados, their restrictions have all been self-imposed by the hunters, which is kind of unique. So they may have started to recognize that what was happening was non-sustainable. And now there's an idea of what the harvest is for all the different jurisdictions. And so I'm going to use Barbados as an example of what happens when you get people involved in making decisions. So next slide. So here, as I said, the hunting is organized by shooting clubs, and they are known as hunting swamps. And there has been a steady decline in the number of hunting or shooting swamps and the harvest of shorebirds due to voluntary actions of hunters. But there's also a few external forces like gun policy and ammunition scarcity that's contributing to this as well. But we have a group of scientists that actually have been working in that part of the world and having conversations with these hunters to have them track what the harvest is, and just having that conversation of sustaining that harvest over time, and knowing that maintaining these habitats is critically important to migrating lesser yellowlegs. There has been some success over time to reduce the shorebird harvest. As you can look at the two graphs, the blue represents the number of active shooting swamps, and now many of those are actual no shooting reserves for the birds. And then in the red, the shorebird harvest has decreased significantly from the 1980s, late 1980s to early 1990s to now, which is positive for the bird. But that's just Barbados. So next slide. Here's an example of the things that need to be done in some of the other jurisdictions to try to kind of shape hearts and minds around conservation and sustainable harvest for shorebirds, including lesser yellowlegs. So in Suriname, for example, fostering a relationship with national government and securing additional funding is important. In Brazil, it's developing harvest, monitoring awareness campaigns, and maintaining low rates of shorebird harvest. So there is some active solutions and active approaches to working with all of these jurisdictions to gain some more appreciation for sustaining populations and increasing the downward direction of shorebird populations. You can read more about the different jurisdictions and what's going on in the Shorebird Plan at shorebirdplan.org website. But what's really important about this slide, if we kind of focus on the human aspect of this, I want to point out that it's incredibly important to involve people. So Katie, next slide. Take a look at this particular slide, and in every one of these jurisdictions, we're fostering relationships, we're doing hunter outreach, investigating the cultural use, thinking about the economic value of a harvest, monitoring and bringing about awareness campaigns, changing economic conditions, and establishing no shooting wetland reserves. So a lot of work is truly going to involve people. It can't just be done focused only on the science. We've got to involve people and help them understand what's going on with this bird and other species as well. So that's just one example of one of the challenges that we're dealing with in the active participation of human dimensions aspects in the work that we do to try to improve populations for lesser yellowlegs. The next example, next slide, actually revolves around improving habitat condition throughout the flyways. So this is going to be a Herculean effort for the hotspot landscapes that we've identified to actually move forward and get some action on the ground. Next slide. So the next biggest challenge that lesser yellowlegs is faced with is habitat loss and has habitat management challenges. And Katie alluded to this earlier in the presentation and talked about the fact that in our prioritization, these types of things rose to the top of challenges that this bird faces. So water and sediment management, lack of quality wetland habitat, competing uses associated with waterfowl management and other competing uses are an issue. Certainly changes in temperature and precipitation. Case in point, this spring, when Shelby was trying to find lesser yellowlegs, the winds were howling at about 50 miles an hour and the temperature was about 20 degrees. So the birds were starting to arrive and life was a little difficult for them up there at that point in time this spring. But what's really important is that a lot of the land where lesser yellowlegs occurs, as Katie talked about, is agricultural land. But the key there is it's private land ownership. And so that's going to be really important for our conservation efforts, is working with private landowners. And I want to just provide a quick example. I don't want you to get too hung up on the graph on the right, but just knowing ways that we can work to advance conservation on the ground using public lands as an anchor. So in an area in Missouri where my team worked for multiple years, it's where the Missouri River and the Mississippi River come together. And it's just north of St. Louis, Missouri. And we have national wildlife refuges in that region. So that's designated by the NWR. And we also have state-owned lands designated by the CA, conservation area. These were wetland areas that are managed for waterfowl and wetland-dependent species. But what we wanted to do was increase the amount of wetlands in that particular area, not only for shorebirds, but also for waterfowl and migrating birds. So really it was for all bird conservation. The problem is that a lot of the wetland habitat was lost. In other words, only 1.3% of this landscape was in wetland habitat. And so it really required a partnership effort, a strong partnership effort to work in that area that's circled in green to bring about change and to improve habitat conditions for the conservation of migratory species. And so that's a similar way that we're going to be thinking about all of these landscapes that we'll be working in for lesser yellowlegs, is potentially looking at areas where we can use protected lands as an anchor, but then build a matrix of habitat in between those areas to improve conditions for lesser yellowlegs and other species in decline. So next slide. One of the ways that we can do that is looking for that commonality. So remember earlier, I was talking about ways that it was important for you to know your landscape and know what's going on. If we think about the habitat concerns for lesser yellowlegs and a farming concern for a landowner, we can see that there's some crossover, there's some commonality there. So again, habitat loss and a lack of water management during critical migration periods for lesser yellowlegs, habitat loss on wintering grounds, changes in precipitation and temperature, and competing uses like waterfowl management. Those are all concerns for lesser yellowlegs. But for a farmer or a working lands landowner, they could be focused on challenges with erosion and sediment loss and nutrient loading and phosphorus and nitrogen loading in adjacent streams and crop yield going down or not getting a good economic return and wanting to improve soil health and fertility. So when you start thinking about how to find common ground, this is one of the best ways to do it. And we do have an activity going on in Mississippi that I want to just talk to you about that speaks to the fact that we can find solutions on working lands with landowners to improve habitat for these species. So Katie, next slide. So I borrowed a lot of this from an article that you can actually read. And this was from Vanessa Gregory, and it's on the website All About Birds. And this is flooding fields in the Mississippi Delta and how it is helping crop yields and shorebirds. Delta Windbirds is an organization that has been working with landowners on private lands. And they're doing that by partnering with agencies to help provide funding and technical assistance for flooding crop fields in the fall during fall migration to address the needs for both people and wildlife. So one of the coolest things about the article is that Vanessa actually makes a connection to the cultural aspect that the Delta is the home of B.B. King. So knowing those little things can connect with people, and that's incredibly important. But the work that Delta Windbirds is doing is helping to clean water, they're improving yield, and they're providing rest and food for migrating shorebirds. So this habitat is temporary. It's just in the fall, and it provides important habitat for migrating lesser yellowlegs. The fall flooding reduces erosion and nitrogen loads into streams by 30 to 40%. Chironomids are the popular invertebrate that are found in these systems, and they're moving carbon around, and that's potentially contributing to soil fertility. And lesser yellowlegs and other shorebirds have a food resource in tons and tons of chironomids. So wetlands not only contribute to the ecological services for people, but also the habitat loss for shorebirds. Next slide. So those are two examples of what we're working on now. We're hoping that what happens as a result of the action strategy is that we'll be able to build on these successful partnerships that are occurring. But I wanted to just touch on what makes a conservation partnership work. And in my work, what I have found is that you've got to have a call to action, and you've got to be able to set goals. And that's both social and biological goals. You have to have leadership that's dedicated to the commitment for the action. In other words, you got to have people that say, yeah, it's okay to work on this, right? You got to be creative. That's probably one of the biggest things that folks miss, is that if the shoe doesn't fit, look for another shoe. There's lots of different ways to slice the pie when you're developing a partnership and finding ways to work together. But you need to take time to build a strong, trusting relationship. You can't just show up on the landscape and say, you know, we've got this bird, it's in trouble, and we think you need to do this. That's probably the wrong approach. You really need to get people in a room and talk about what each other is dealing with. That's really critical to getting people together to work on a common problem. You have to be willing to listen to one another, and you need to set smart objectives. You need to have a timeline. You need to know what your objectives and goals are in each landscape. And as you move forward, if you mess up, you need to be adaptive. You need to celebrate your successes, and you need to monitor your success. So those are really key and critical things that you need to do. Next slide. But sometimes you might not know who your stakeholders are and what they might care about. And in those instances, there's an organization known as RARE that can help you put together a problem statement and actually find ways to engage people using levers of behavior change. And so what that means is it might be sharing information with others, keying in on emotions, focusing in on rules and regulations so that people understand reasons why there's a problem, providing social influences and possibilities for incentives to action, which is kind of what Delta Windbirds is doing, and focusing on a choice for architecture. So what that means is the purposeful structuring of the context, the timing, and the presentation of options to influence a decision. RARE can help break down these issues for you if you need their assistance, and you can find them at rare.org. We're actually working with RARE to find out what other landowner attitudes might be in working to do habitat work in the lower Mississippi alluvial valley. So that hasn't occurred yet. We're still working on the process there, but in this representation, there was an issue with red knots and being exposed to things that were not good for it when it arrived on its wintering grounds. And so RARE helped bring together a red knot migration mascot and helped the locals form a festival and built an educational center around red knot conservation. So that was a success story that RARE actually participated in. And really what it helps do is evaluates attitudes and perceptions and provides feedback and next steps for you to move forward with your conservation efforts. Next slide. I would be remiss not to give a plug to Partnerscapes. Partnerscapes is a grassroots movement of private landowners working with agencies and nonprofit organizations and policymakers to collaborate on all kinds of conservation projects. And that work is to help sustain working landscapes for not only current folks, but also future generations. They work under 5 major pillars, and that is that they're landowner-led, that collaboration gets the work done, meaning partnerships, local lessons have a national impact, and they support voluntary incentive-based programs. They also believe that sustainability is a balance between ecology and economy. So that gets back to know your landscape, know the people who live, work, and play there. Partnerscapes is going to be at the R2R conference And we'll actually be having a breakout session with Partnerscapes to talk about building those trusting relationships and talk about ways that you can work with local community leaders, landowners, and other stakeholders to build conservation success that benefit birds and communities. And I don't think anybody could say it best than Brad Andrus, where he said, I think that's the kind of way we're headed in parts of the bird conservation community, of trying to really figure out what the human well-being benefits are for shorebird habitats. They're not just for birds, but for birds and people. And I would say that that's not just for lesser yellowlegs. It's not just for birds. It's for all wildlife. We've got to find a way to work with working landscapes so that we can build a strong, sustainable environment for the future. Next slide. None of this work would be possible without the support of our funding organizations and agencies who've made our efforts for our working group possible. Katie alluded to the Knobloch Family Foundation earlier. They have been critical in advancing the work of the Lesser Yellowlegs Working Group, and my position would not have been possible without them. Alaska Department of Fish and Game has been paramount in helping guide the science of the work that is being done. The joint base of Elmendorf and Richardson is a DoD area that a lot of the breeding work is being done on in Alaska, and they've provided the lands for us to do our work. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has been a critical partner in what we're doing. And USAID has been very pivotal in helping with the work that's being conducted in the Pampas of Argentina. So with that, Katie, next slide. These are our working group members, and we thank you for your attention and time. Is there any questions from anyone? I'll turn it back over to Quinn and she can help us with that.
Thank you so much, Kelly and Katie, for a really amazing presentation. It's such a great blend of biology and social science and a lot of hard work that's gone into the progress of our knowledge on the species. So thank you very much. And we have time for questions. Feel free to raise your hand or post them in the chat, and we will direct them to Kelly and Katie. Yes, Steve.
Hi, everyone. Great presentation. I have a couple of questions related to the harvesting pressure that's occurring in the Caribbean. First is that although the numbers of birds harvested in Barbados is going down, which is encouraging, I'm wondering if that's really just because the overall abundance of the bird is declining. What does it look like to scale that harvest in terms of a total percentage of the population in those different years where data is available, through the decades. So that's question one. And then related to that, I was wondering if there was any evidence that the hunting pressure, which seems to be primarily focused on these eastern populations, shows that those eastern populations are declining more quickly than the populations in the western part of North America that aren't migrating through that area with high hunting pressure.
I don't know if Kelly, you want to take a crack at that, but I could start by saying that yes, there's been quite a dramatic decline over time in the overall population size, and so that's a good point. But we did see in Barbados a decline in harvest, but an increase in harvest in other areas. So I think we would have seen a decline across all of the different areas if that was the case. Kelly, I don't know if you have anything else to add to that.
I actually don't, Katie, but Steve, you did bring up a really good point, and we actually have a working group meeting coming up. So I'm going to pose this question to Brad because he's the expert on that. And we'll get back to you with more details. Yeah,
and there was a reduction in, I believe, I'm not the harvest expert on our group either. I believe there's a decline in the shooting swamp habitat. So that is linked to the decline in harvest. There just aren't as many birds stopping in that area. And then what was the second part of your question? The eastern and western breeding populations. Can you just read that part?
Wondering if there was evidence for a steeper decline in the eastern populations that were exposed to this hunting pressure more so than the western populations.
Yeah, that is something that we really would like to quantify, and it's pretty hard to get breeding bird survey data for the eastern populations. There's just more data for central and the western part of their breeding range, and so delving down into those smaller areas or they're large areas, but there's just not the population size, and there's not the monitoring in those northern parts of eastern Canada. But that is something that we have talked about a lot to really develop geographically specific trends for the different geographic regions, with the knowledge that breeding populations are exposed to different threats, so especially as adults. And so it'll be interesting to look at the survival rates of Churchill birds compared to Anchorage and Canute birds, because the Churchill birds have a much higher likelihood of migrating through that harvest zone. So that's one thing that we can look at once we have enough data from Churchill to calculate adult survival rates. Yeah, so hopefully that answers your question.
I don't see any questions, so I'll ask one while people get their juices flowing. I was just wondering if you could maybe talk about some of the different organizations, individuals across this landscape that you are working with. It seems like you have a really extensive network of partners and you have a lot of different interests. So are there different strategies for approaching some of these different groups in different regions, or who have different goals and interests? And how have you kind of shaped your strategy for interacting with these different groups?
So we're just now beginning to kind of connect with different groups in local areas, but it really revolves around knowing some of the leadership in the big hotspot focal areas, and then having those folks help us build the network of conservation influencers in that part of the world, including landowners. So, you know, the hope, at least working with private lands, is that in the United States, we're certainly going to be involving folks that actually have funding to help landowners, like the Natural Resources Conservation Service, the Fish and Wildlife Service through the Partners for Fish and Wildlife program, state agencies through their private land programs, and a myriad of non-government organizations that not only can help with funding, but also can help with technical assistance. So it's really an all hands on deck kind of approach, but the local conservation organizations and leadership is going to depend on the particular landscape we're going to be working in, whether it's in South America, the United States, or Canada.
And Kelly is so well connected, especially with groups in North America that are working with private landowners. So that has been just such a huge benefit for our working group. And we're trying to expand our reach to communities and conservation organizations working in South America. So that's an area that we have a lot of room for growth. And we've been lucky enough to have a couple people working in South America on our working group. And so they provide a lot of input into, they've got their fingers on the pulse in places like Argentina and Colombia. And so we are looking forward to growing that aspect of our conservation and outreach.
Do you have any other questions from the audience? I guess I have a biology question. I have tons of questions, so other people should chime in. I was just wondering if you noticed any sex differences in dispersal. I know you talked about that really interesting movement from the offspring who was hatched in Quebec and moved to Alaska. If you know that any, sex biases in these dispersal patterns. I'm guessing tracking sample sizes are small, so maybe TBD.
Yeah, we did not detect a sex difference in dispersal. Most of the birds returned to within a few hundred meters of their original capture location the previous year. A couple individuals dispersed further than that, maybe a kilometer or more. But there wasn't a trend, an obvious trend with it being males or females that disperse. But it was just such a, the overwhelming theme was that they really did prefer to come back to the same breeding site. But it was a subset of the data. It wasn't, like I said, it was only those birds that we could that were continuing to transmit and survived the following May. So we would really need more data and more power to detect whether there could well be differences among the sexes, but we didn't have the power to detect that. And we didn't see a sex-specific difference in survival rates. So that wasn't an informative covariate that we tested.
Awesome, thank you. And it looks like Katie has a question.
Thanks, can you hear me okay? I was curious about the GPS transmitters and what other technology you're looking into to minimize that impact for future tracking. And have you used MODIS tags?
I personally haven't used MODIS tags, but others on the working group have. For the study I was involved with, we used GPS transmitters that were mounted as backpacks.
Right.
Using leg loop harnesses, and looking at wind tunnel experiments, it seems like the size is not as important as the shape of the transmitter, and it reduces, having it sit on the back like that really reduces the aerodynamic ability of the bird to, so it would increase the amount of energy that the bird would have to put into migrating.
Right.
So that is the mechanism. And we are much more conservative about putting these tags on the lesser yellowlegs because they are sensitive to them. And so we've largely wrapped up that component, and we are more supportive of studies that are putting temporary, like transmitters that will fall off after a few months, and more lightweight, smaller transmitters.
Thank you.
It doesn't seem to be the case for all species. I mean, I just analyzed a data set for olive-sided flycatchers, and they had no effect of transmitters. So it's interesting. It's very species specific.
Yeah, I've been really looking into that too. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Right, final call for questions. All right, I think that, I guess, concludes the wonderful presentation. Thank you again, Kelly and Katie.
And I'll close out. Thank you, Quinn, for doing a great job of facilitating, and Kelly and Katie. What a wonderful presentation! Fantastic presentation. Now I know why you are one of our champion pilot species that doing such great work. Thank you all for joining, particularly on this day ahead of a holiday weekend. We will put this webinar up on our website in the coming days, so that if you missed a portion of it, or you want to refer to it, or ask your colleagues to see it, it'll be on r2rbirds.org's website. And again, please consider joining us at our workshop at NCTC in January. As Kelly said, Partnerscapes will be there for a portion of that, and we're looking forward to overlapping with some landowners, private landowners that have a conservation mind and look at strategies to a number of species, but the lesser yellowlegs in particular. And we welcome any feedback you might have on this webinar series. So feel free to send us an email or post a note to us in the chat. We'd love to hear your thoughts on it. I know this might have not been the best Friday to have a webinar in advance of a big holiday week. But in the future, we are looking forward to have good attendance, great attendance. The next one will be Friday, December the 8th. In the meantime, I hope everybody has a happy, from the United States, happy Thanksgiving, and enjoy your weekend. Thank you all for joining us.